I'm going to focus my presentation around three key questions. First, how are local governments responding to immigrants nationwide? And I'm going to show that they actually tend towards welcoming responses. Second, I'm going to look into why it is that local governments are motivated to welcome immigrants. And then third, what are effective strategies for local immigrant incorporation, both in terms of supporting immigrants and encouraging public acceptance? So my presentation rests on my book, Welcoming New Americans, which you see on the left-hand side of your screen. The book draws on a survey of local government officials, as well as case studies from smaller cities, including Lewiston, Maine, and Wausau, Wisconsin, and Yakima, Washington, which you'll hear more about from our speakers later today. But the data that I'm going to be discussing comes from a more recent survey that I conducted in 2016, which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. So before I start, a few words about my survey, just so you understand where my data is coming from. The survey asks local government officials what they're doing in response to immigrants in terms of both informal practices and formal policies. And then it also asks local officials what they think they should be doing in response to immigrants. So the sample includes municipalities 5,000 and up in population that are at least 5% foreign-born. And the sampling method prioritizes larger places such that we have 84 of the 100 largest cities in the sample, as well as a representative sample of smaller cities across the United States. In each town, there are 4 officials that are surveyed. So the mayor, a randomly selected city councilor, the police chief, and the city manager or a lead appointed official. We received 1,400 responses from officials across 814 towns in 49 states. So that's one response from at least 81% of the towns that were surveyed. Of course, some officials in some towns didn't respond, but the good news is that that wasn't related to the demographic or partisan or geographic characteristics of the towns. So we can feel confident that this is a good representative view of how US towns and cities are responding to immigrants. So turning first to the question of how local governments are responding to immigrants nationwide, what you see on this slide is a summary of what proportion of towns and cities in the United States tend toward restriction and what proportion tend towards accommodation, as well as what proportion is sort of largely inactive in responding to immigrant residents. So first, some definitions. By restrictive, I mean efforts that aim to decrease immigrants' presence or opportunities locally. I won't go into the details on these restrictive practices too much since it's not our focus today, but what we see is that fewer than 1 in 5 towns is tending toward restriction, which might be somewhat surprising given the prominent anti-immigrant rhetoric that we see at the federal and to some degree state level. On the flip side, though, 45% of towns are tending toward accommodation or welcoming policies. By accommodation, I mean local practices that aim to increase immigrants' presence or opportunities on the local level. And this chart includes 11 local accommodating practices that aim to include immigrants in decision-making, engage with immigrant communities, and provide services to immigrants. I'll provide some more detailed examples of those local accommodating practices in just a moment. So the high levels of accommodation and the relatively low levels of restriction might seem like good news, but it's also worth noting that more than 1/3 of towns reported no major responses to immigrants. So the items that are actually counted on this chart are all things that required deliberation and collaboration among local officials. And just over 1/3 of towns reported that they hadn't done any of these things. Now, that doesn't mean that they were doing nothing in response to immigrants. Most of them were complying with linguistic access provisions, and many of them were doing less strenuous responses to immigrants that maybe were implemented by a single official. Overall, though, what we see from this chart is we have 1/3 of towns and cities that are largely inactive. We have less than 20% that tend toward restriction, and a plurality of towns, nearly half, are tending towards accommodation or welcoming. So this chart lists the 6 most prevalent accommodating practices asked about in the survey. So you see here that 60% of towns and cities are saying that they've hired immigrants in municipal governance. 49%, nearly half, are saying that they've recruited immigrants to serve on local boards and commissions. 44% are saying that they've provided in-kind support for immigrants, perhaps by letting local organizations use facilities free of charge. 41% say that they've partnered with NGOs to provide services to immigrants. More than 1/3 say that they've hosted intercultural events or sponsored them. And then more than 1/4 say that they've educated the public about immigrants. So for instance, perhaps educating the public about a newly arrived refugee population. So all of these efforts to welcome immigrants are more prevalent among larger cities and more prevalent in places with larger foreign-born populations, as we would expect. So you see here that a third of places say that they overall say that they hosted intercultural events. If you get to cities 150,000 and greater, 92% of them say that they're doing that kind of thing. So larger places are not only implementing more accommodating provisions, they also tend to be implementing more strenuous or intensive accommodating provisions, for instance, such as having a local commission or office for immigrant affairs. So in sum, what the survey is showing us is that despite the anti-immigrant rhetoric at the federal level, in some states and in a handful of well-publicized smaller towns, most towns and cities are interested in welcoming immigrants. So this prevalence of accommodation, the fact that it's what most localities are doing, means that it's really crucial that we understand how to do it well. And that means addressing both immigrant advancement and public acceptance. So before I turn to specific strategies, I want to say a few words about why it is that local officials tend to welcome immigrants. Some of you wanted to understand how to make local officials more welcoming, and so I think that the motivations that I found may be helpful in this. These findings build off interviews with more than 200 officials and residents across 4 smaller immigrant destinations. And then these are corroborated in my more recent surveys that look at a broader range of places. So in my interviews, it became clear to me that local officials tend to welcome immigrants because for the most part, they see them as clients, they see them as contributors, and as community members worthy of protection from discrimination. So local officials see immigrants as clients, as you see on the screen here, because they're required to serve immigrants. For instance, in K-12 schools, through linguistic access provisions elsewhere, due to civil rights laws. So serving immigrants is a local legal responsibility. In addition, local officials are motivated to serve immigrants because they see them as economic contributors, whether as workers, as consumers, or as entrepreneurs. So local governments are really sharply constrained when it comes to the ways that they can raise revenue. And so they see immigrants as a potential economic development engine. Lastly, I find that when restrictive episodes do occur, and they do, of course, on the local level, we're all aware of the news stories. So maybe you have a hate crime, maybe you have a local government that passes an anti-immigrant ordinance. I find that local officials are sensitive to the reputational consequences of those episodes. So when towns and cities implement restriction, they tend to have external scrutiny from the media, from regulators, from advocacy organizations. And you're probably familiar with the most intransigent cases, the cases where a restrictive policy is implemented and then the officials sort of stick with it to the bitter end through court battles. But I'm able to show in my research that those places are actually the exceptions. In most places, local officials are wary of being associated with discrimination, wary of being associated with racism. And so they tend to sort of rein in restriction and even promote accommodation in response. In other words, they see immigrants as community members that are worthy of protection from discrimination. So to summarize the data from the survey to show that these are broadly corroborated, 75% of officials say that they see serving immigrants as a part of their professional duty, and 56%, more than half, say that serving immigrants is important for complying with federal regulations such as civil rights laws. In other words, local officials are seeing immigrant residents as their clients. 58% say that serving immigrants is important for economic development, and only 14% of officials disagree with this statement, although some are sort of in the middle as neutral. In other words, most local officials are seeing immigrants as economic contributors. And lastly, 73% of officials say that serving immigrants is an important way to show that their locality welcomes diversity. So in other words, nearly 3/4 of officials see the importance of embracing immigrants as diverse community members. Of course, it's really important to note here that there are forces pushing these local officials in the opposite direction. We have the increasingly polarized partisan discussions over immigration. We have the devolution of immigration enforcement to the local level. But what I find in my research is at least up until the present, localities have been fairly resilient to those forces because of these strong motivations to welcome immigrants that local governments face. So the good news then is that there are clear legal and economic incentives for municipal officials to support immigrants as clients, contributors, and community members. The challenge comes that the broader public doesn't necessarily share these incentives or these understandings of immigrants. So as I think so many of you are aware, incorporation is very much a two-way street. And that's why it's so crucial that when we're developing strategies for local welcoming, we attend to both one side of the street, which is immigrant advancement and enabling immigrants to achieve mobility in our society, and then the other side of the street, which is encouraging public acceptance. So I'm going to make 3 brief suggestions for strategies that attend to both sides of that equation, and I know my fellow presenters will delve more deeply into specifics from their work on the ground. So the first strategy that I want to highlight is building meaningful contact among diverse groups. So there's a well-established body of social science literature that's called the contact theory that shows that it's possible to get diverse people together in ways that reduce stereotyping and increase intergroup harmony. But it requires that you fulfill 3 conditions which are listed on your screen. So the first is easy if you have a local government that's interested in doing this. You need the explicit approval of an authority figure for the enterprise of increasing harmony between groups. The second is that you need to engage people from different groups in a shared task, which is why we have the image of the barn raising on your screen here. And the third is the hardest. You have to establish a scenario in which people are coming together for this shared project on an even playing field. So you can imagine that classrooms at any level, elementary school up to college level, and youth sports teams are great venues for this in fulfilling those 3 conditions. But there are other venues that with some thought, it's possible to engage adults in this way. So for instance, carefully planned workplace or neighborhood events. So I won't delve too much into the detail, but those are sort of guiding principles for ways to engage communities in meaningful contact that build both immigrant advancement and public acceptance of immigrants. The second strategy that I want to mention is building immigrant organizations. What I find in my work is that local officials, and this is particularly in smaller cities, tend to rely on individual immigrant intermediaries when they're soliciting information about or conveying information to immigrant residents. So when I look at my survey, individual contacts within the immigrant community are one of the most commonly cited sources of information about immigrants in the survey. And this is problematic. Relying on individual immigrants is problematic because singular individuals obviously can't represent diverse immigrant residents, even within a single ethnic group. So the picture that you're seeing here actually comes from Wausau, Wisconsin, where the local government worked with Hmong refugees to develop the Wausau Area Hmong Mutual Association, which is now called the Hmong American Center. And the center allowed immigrants to build a civic presence locally, to have a civic voice, but it also allowed the public to see immigrant efforts to engage as local community members. And the local government was able to provide assistance that sort of fostered the growth of the organization that then both gave this voice and allowed the public to begin to accept the immigrants on their own terms. Lastly, as I mentioned before, when restrictive episodes do arise, there's a way to get localities back on track. So if you can attract external scrutiny from the media, from advocacy groups, and from regulators, local officials tend to be sensitive to the reputational consequences of appealing discriminatory, and they tend to rein in restriction and often even become more accommodating in response. So just to sum up, local governments tend towards accommodation because they face unique incentives to see immigrants as clients, as contributors, and community members worthy of protection from discrimination. Unfortunately, the general public doesn't necessarily share these understandings, and so to build unity, we need strategies that address both immigrant advancement and public acceptance, and I've highlighted some of these on the screen, but there are more details in my book. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Abby. That was an incredible presentation. I do encourage everyone to get her book. It's available on Amazon. Just one quick question. You don't distinguish between undocumented and documented immigrants. You look at the foreign-born as a whole because they are all community members and they're all workers and contributors, correct?
Yeah, so local officials, at least in some places, do see a distinction between documented and undocumented immigrants because that's become so politically salient. But in terms of local government's obligations to immigrants, it really isn't relevant. They're required to serve immigrants on the local level in so many ways, and immigrants, regardless of their status, are contributing in so many ways. And so while it may be seen as politically relevant, it really isn't in terms of the daily work.